Hey guys, welcome to week 2 of Tune In. If you didn't know, this is a series based off of Winter Retreat, which you can find all the sessions at Virginia NYI on YouTube. So we're just going to jump in again because we like to do that. So last week we talked about Eli and Samuel, remember? Mm-hmm. Eli was a prophet, Samuel was a prophet in training. Yeah. And he heard from God, he tuned into God, and we didn't decide, the Bible decided, God decided that because Samuel was able to tune into his voice, like that would set the course of a nation. Yep. That's like a big jump, but that's basically where we got.
Yeah.
And so the point was tuning into God's voice matters.
Yes.
Changes things. So now we're going to look at 2 different characters in this same story, David and Saul. Mm-hmm. I'm going to give you like a really quick rundown of the story. If you want the details, read 1 Samuel. But here is like the story in a quick situation. So, are you timing me?
I don't know why.
so here's what happened. The people of Israel wanted a king. And God was like, I am your king. You don't want a king. And they were like, no, we want like a king in the flesh. Mm-hmm. And God was like, no, you don't. And they were like, yes, we do. So God was like, okay, fine. Here's a king. His name is Saul. He looks like a king. He's like tall. He's got his brawny king vibes. Yeah. But he didn't come from a family of kings.
Yeah.
And so God's like, here's your king. And so Saul is the king. And Saul like really is chasing after like an earthly kingdom, right? He's trying to build an earthly kingdom, and God is like, never mind, thank you, next. Yeah. God rejects Saul, and so he sends Samuel, our old prophet in training, to anoint the next king named David. Mm-hmm. You know some stories about David, probably David and Goliath, David and Bathsheba, dicey. And so he sends Samuel to anoint David. He does that. David is not kingly. He is a shepherd. He is the youngest in his family, but God anoints him, and that really makes Saul mad. Mm-hmm. And so Saul hunts David. He tries to kill him because he's jealous. But in the end, Saul actually dies, and David becomes king, and David's kingship is much more successful because he knows the voice of God. Mm-hmm. He's building a heavenly kingdom, not necessarily an earthly kingdom. That's not to say David didn't have flaws. Mm-hmm. We know about Bathsheba, but he was a man after God's own heart.
Yeah.
And so he was more successful in God's eyes than Saul.
Yes.
That's the story.
How did you do? It was great. It was perfect. Super fast. I wanted to read this one verse.
Please.
And it is under the heading, "The Lord Rejects Saul." So I mean, like, happy, uplifting, real good one. It says, Then the Lord said to Samuel, I am sorry that I ever made Saul king, for he has not been loyal to me and has refused to obey my command. Samuel was so deeply moved when he heard this that he cried out to the Lord all night. So the difference was not their leadership ability. Like, Saul was making military moves,
right.
And he had the people in support of him. He looked like he fit the role, and he was doing the things to build the earthly kingdom of Israel. But God didn't just say, I'm going to go have a conversation with Saul and maybe like shift. He said, I'm done, because all the earthly success in the world doesn't matter because he's not listening. He's not tuned into my voice. And so he may be making earthly gains, but he is making heavenly steps back.
Yeah.
And so David, after that, the Lord tells Samuel to anoint David as the next king. And they both come from humble beginnings, David and Saul. And David does not look like who the nation would choose. So it's like, not just that they don't have this big background, either of them, but this one in particular,
right.
The nation would be like,
he doesn't seem right.
We just need a bigger dude than the last dude.
Right.
And God says, I'm going to give you a real little guy. It'll turn out. And David also has leadership skills. he gathers people around him. He does win victories for the nation, but he also has flaws, like Saul had flaws. But like you said, the difference is we know that David was a man after God's own heart.
Right.
He was listening to God. He was talking to God. He was trying to lean into what God wanted for him and what God wanted for the nation. He was in pursuit of building God's kingdom.
Yeah.
And that's the big difference. He was tuned in, and because he was tuned in, things went well.
Right.
Even when he made mistakes.
Yeah. So let's put this in the context of a middle schooler, high schooler.
Okay.
Because even like when I think about this, I'm like, well, that is like big because they're kings of a nation.
Yes. Middle schoolers, I heard, are not kings of nations.
Not the last I heard.
Right.
And so I think we can hear the story and think like, well, that doesn't so much apply to me because I'm not ruling a nation. But how old was David when God anointed him? I'm asking you all the time. He was not,
young.
My point is that he was not old.
Youngish.
He was the youngest of his family.
Yeah.
He was working in the fields as a shepherd. He wasn't like running a household.
No.
He wasn't married.
No, he was the sandwich guy to bring the sandwiches to his brother.
Right. And so like God uses a young person to do like, he didn't become king right then when he was anointed.
Right.
But God kind of like used someone to prophesy this. God spoke to David through someone else about his future. And like, I don't think that David was like, well, that's good for my future.
Yeah. So
I'm just gonna like do what I want to do now, and then when that time comes.
Yeah.
We actually read in the story that David is like pursuing this role the whole time.
Yeah.
Like he's trying to stay alive because Saul is hunting him because Saul is mad.
Yeah.
And so he kind of is living his like young adult life in pursuit of what God has for him.
Yeah.
And he only could do that because
he was pursuing God.
He was pursuing God. He knew the voice of God. He was tuned into his voice. And so he knew that the word that he had someone else speak over him was true.
Yeah. And
so his life had to be lived in a way that he believed that was true and that God would be faithful to bring him to that position.
Yeah. I think one thing that like I would want you guys to hear is that when we look at you, we see these potential leaders. We see the potential that God has for you. And so our David goes and he like plays the harp for Saul.
Right.
Like that's where he starts out. He's like he brings his brothers the sandwiches. He plays he's the youth band.
That's right. He's the youth band.
He's the youth band in the courts, and he's just doing the things faithfully that are in his now.
Right.
He doesn't have
He's working at Chick-fil-A.
Yeah, he doesn't have a game plan for how working at Chick-fil-A is going to turn him into a CEO.
Yeah.
But he says, in this moment, how am I going to do this thing faithfully? I'm going to tune into the voice of God.
Right, and that's like shocking. That's all he had to do.
Yeah. Was
tune into the voice of God.
Yeah.
That's all you got to do. So talk about that.
Yes.
Have a good conversation about that, and know that word is true for you today too. That is like the power of the scripture, is that it's not just true for David.
Yeah.
Like it's relevant for you today too. So I hope you have a good conversation.
Yep.
I think you will. Remember, because your leaders are
phenomenal.
So we'll see you next time.